He wasn't looking at the pigeons, that's what I noticed first. Everyone else on that sidewalk in front of my old house was either walking somewhere or staring at their phone. But this man, gray jacket, dark tie, maybe 60 years old, was standing completely still by the maple tree at the end of the driveway, and he was watching me, not the moving truck. Not my ex-wife Diane standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Me. I had 3 boxes left, 3 boxes and a duffel bag, and that was the sum total of what 12 years of marriage had left me with. The rest, the house in Oakville, the Tacoma, the furniture we'd picked out together at that IKEA on Winston Churchill, all of it had been awarded to Diane by the court 14 days ago. Her lawyer had been very thorough, I'll give him that. I picked up the last box and the man started walking toward me. "Excuse me." His voice was quiet, not aggressive, not nervous, just flat and deliberate, the way someone talks when they've had the same conversation 100 times and learned to strip all the emotion out of it. "Are you Nathan Bourke?" I set the box down on the curb. "Who's asking?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Philip Strand, Estate and Trust Services, Toronto. There was a Bay Street address underneath. "My name is Philip Strand," he said. "I represent the estate of your great-uncle, Gerald Bourke. Mr. Bourke passed away 11 days ago at his residence in Collingwood. You've been named in the estate documents." I looked at the card. I looked at him. Behind me, I heard the front door close. "Gerald," I said. "I haven't spoken to Gerald in maybe 15 years. "That's correct," Philip said. He was aware of that. It didn't change his decision. "What decision?" Philip glanced briefly over my shoulder at the closed door. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere else." We sat in his car, a dark blue Volvo parked 2 houses down. He opened a leather portfolio on the center console and handed me a single sheet of paper, not a photocopy, the actual document, printed on heavy cream-colored stock with a notary seal at the bottom. Gerald Bourke, deceased. Property in Collingwood, a registered investment portfolio, a cabin outside of Parry Sound, and a cash value listed that made me read the line 3 times. "This is real," I said. "It wasn't really a question. It's entirely real," Philip said. "Your great-uncle was a private man. Most people in your family were not aware of what he'd accumulated over his lifetime. He worked in commercial real estate for 40 years, made several significant investments in the 90s, and lived, as you may remember." I did remember, actually. Gerald had a house that smelled like wood smoke and motor oil. He drove a truck that should have been retired 10 years before it was. Every Christmas, he sent a card with a $20 bill inside and a note that said, "Spend it on something you actually want." I thought he was just a retired uncle living quietly somewhere north of the city. "There are conditions," Philip said. I put the paper down. Of course there were conditions. Philip explained them without any particular drama, like he was reading from a grocery list. Gerald had been watching our family from a distance for a long time. According to Philip, Gerald had a way of knowing things, nothing illegal, nothing intrusive, just the kind of steady attention that comes from someone who actually pays attention. He'd watched my father walk out when I was 9. He'd watched my mother work 2 jobs in Mississauga until her knees gave out. He'd watched me build a small landscaping business from nothing, watched me marry Diane, watched the marriage slowly turn into something neither of us recognized anymore. And apparently he'd watched Diane's lawyers spend 8 months systematically taking apart everything I'd built. "Mr. Bourke was very specific," Philip said. "He believed that what happened to you was not simply bad luck or a failed marriage. He believed you were outmaneuvered by people with more resources than you and that the outcome was not a fair reflection of who you are or what you'd contributed." I didn't say anything. "He wanted to correct the imbalance," Philip continued, "but he also wanted to know, genuinely know, that you were capable of building something real, not just receiving it. The conditions were 3. First, I had to keep the Collingwood property maintained and occupied for a minimum of 90 days. Not a hotel situation, actually live there, handle the property, deal with whatever it needed. Second, I had to resolve a specific outstanding matter related to Gerald's business, a small parcel of land near Barrie that had been in a quiet legal dispute for years, tangled up in county records and a neighboring property owner who'd been encroaching on the boundary for over a decade. Gerald had never bothered fighting it. His instruction was that I had to resolve it properly, through the right channels without paying anyone off or walking away from it. Third, and this one took me a moment to absorb, I had to go 60 days without contacting Diane, her lawyer, or responding to any legal communications they sent, unless initiated through my own legal representation. "That last one," I said, "that's not a condition about building anything." What is that?" Philip was quiet for a second. "Mr. Bourke felt," he said carefully, "that one of your patterns, and he said this with genuine respect, was that you had a tendency to keep trying to fix things that were no longer yours to fix. He wanted you to practice letting go." I sat with that for a long moment. Outside the window, I could see the moving truck still idling at the end of the driveway. My whole previous life, sitting in 3 cardboard boxes on a curb in Oakville. "What happens if I don't meet the conditions?" I asked. The estate is liquidated and the proceeds go to a conservation land trust Gerald had been supporting for 20 years, and if I do, everything transfers to you, fully and without encumbrance. I picked up the document again, Gerald Bourke. The man with the wood smokehouse and the $20 Christmas bills. He knew I'd be standing on that curb today, I said. How did he know that? Philip straightened his portfolio and didn't answer right away. Mr. Bourke was a patient man, he said finally. He'd been watching for a long time. The drive up to Collingwood took just under 2 hours. I had my duffel bag in the back of a rented Civic. They wouldn't let me keep the Tacoma, not even to move my own belongings, and the document in an envelope on the passenger seat, and I kept glancing at it like it might disappear if I stopped paying attention. I called my mother from the highway. Her name is Sharon, and she picked up on the second ring the way she always does, like she's been waiting by the phone since 1987 and she's just not going to admit it. Nathan, where are you? Heading north, I said. I told her about Philip Strand. I told her about Gerald. There was a silence on the line that went on long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Gerald, she said finally. Her voice had gone soft. Did you know he had money, Mom? No, she said, not like that. I knew he'd done well. He never talked about it. You know how he was. Nathan. She paused. He came to your grandfather's funeral. Do you remember? You were maybe 7 or 8. He stood at the back the whole time and didn't talk to anyone, and then afterward he found me in the parking lot and he handed me an envelope. He said, don't open it until you're home. It was $3,000 in cash, no note, no explanation, just $3,000. Her voice wavered slightly. I never properly thanked him. I didn't have anything to say to that. I just drove. Be careful up there, she said before she hung up. And Nathan, do the conditions. Whatever they are, do them. The Collingwood property was not what I expected. I'd been imagining something modest, a small bungalow, maybe a double garage, the kind of place a cautious retired man would own. What I found at the end of a gravel lane off the 7th concession was a cedar-sided property sitting on 4 acres of mixed forest, with a long front porch, a detached workshop the size of a small barn, and a view over a field that caught the evening light in a way that made me stop the car and just sit there for a minute. The house needed work. The front porch had 2 boards that needed replacing. One of the windows in the back bedroom had a cracked seal and had fogged over. The workshop had a roof that had lost some shingles in what must have been a significant wind event, and there was a section of fence along the west side of the property that had been knocked flat, by a deer, probably, given the tracks in the mud around it. I walked the whole property that first evening. 4 acres doesn't sound like much until you're walking it alone in the quiet, in the particular kind of silence that you only get an hour outside the city, where the only sounds are your own footsteps and whatever the wind is doing in the trees. I was 41 years old. I had a duffel bag and $3,000 in my checking account, and a piece of paper that said I might inherit $2 million if I could hold myself together for 90 days. I went inside and made coffee with the supplies Philip had arranged to have stocked, and I sat on the porch in the dark and I thought about what Diane's lawyer had said in the final settlement meeting. He'd said, and I remember this precisely because I wrote it down afterward, the way you write down things that hurt you so you don't accidentally forget how much they hurt. He'd said, my client's concern of Mr. Bourke has demonstrated a consistent pattern of financial instability and an inability to sustain the kind of responsible household management that the children's well-being requires. Financial instability. I had paid every mortgage payment for 9 years. I had kept that landscaping business running through 2 recessions and a pandemic year when half my commercial contracts evaporated overnight. I had filed my taxes on time every single year since I was 19 years old. But he had taken the Tacoma. That was the part that kept surfacing. In the final asset division, Diane's lawyer had argued that the truck was a business asset used primarily for personal travel, and the judge had agreed, and so I'd had to hand over the keys to the vehicle I'd owned since before the marriage, the vehicle I needed to actually get to job sites, the vehicle I had paid off entirely with my own money before Diane and I had even gotten serious. And then, not 2 weeks later, her lawyer had cited my inability to maintain stable employment as a factor in the custody arrangement. I sat on that porch for a long time. Then I went inside, found a notepad in the kitchen drawer, and started making a list of everything the property needed. The Barrie land dispute turned out to be more complicated than Philip had made it sound, which I suspected was deliberate on Gerald's part. The neighboring property belonged to a man named, I'll be accurate here, a man I'll call the neighbor, because his actual name became relevant to a legal proceeding and I'd rather not put it in here. He'd been running a piece of agricultural fencing about 40 meters inside Gerald's registered property line for at least 12 years, possibly longer. The county had no record of any easement agreement. There was no documentation of any arrangement between him and Gerald. The land simply had a fence on it that shouldn't have been there. When I drove out to the Barrie property the first time, the neighbor came out of his house before I'd even gotten out of the car. You the nephew, he said. Great nephew, I said. Nathan Bourke. He was a large man, mid-60s, with a particular kind of self-possession that comes from owning land in a county for 40 years and never having been seriously challenged on anything. He looked at me the way people look at something they've decided isn't worth much. "Your uncle and I had an understanding," he said. "What kind of understanding?" "The kind where he didn't bother me about that fence." I looked at the fence. Then I looked at him. "Do you have anything in writing?" "Don't need anything in writing." I drove back to Collingwood and called a property lawyer in Barrie that afternoon. Her name was Joelle. I found her through a referral from Philip, and she turned out to be exactly what the situation needed: quiet, precise, and completely unimpressed by men who thought an informal agreement was the same thing as a legal one. "This is straightforward," she told me on the phone. "The registered survey is clear. There's no easement on record. He's been encroaching for over a decade, which in Ontario doesn't give him any prescriptive rights because the encroachment has to be open, continuous, and exclusive, and a fence that your client never contested doesn't automatically become an adverse possession claim if the property was never actually abandoned. So what do? We send a formal notice. We give him 30 days to remove the fence voluntarily. If he doesn't, we file for a boundary survey and a removal order. It'll take a few months, but it's not complicated. The county records are on our side. Can he fight it?" "He can try," she said. "People do. It usually costs them more than it's worth." The notice went out the following week. The neighbor did not respond within 30 days. We filed. I was on the Collingwood property for 6 weeks when I found the envelope. I'd been doing the repairs systematically, the porch boards first, then the workshop roof, then the cracked window seal, and I'd gotten to the workshop, which I was cleaning out section by section. Gerald had been an organized man. His tools were hung on pegboard in clean rows. His hardware was sorted into labeled bins. There was a filing cabinet against the back wall, locked, and I'd been putting off dealing with it because I didn't have the key. I found the key in a small wooden box on a shelf above the workbench, under a coffee tin full of nails, and in the filing cabinet's top drawer, underneath a folder of property records and old insurance documents, there was an envelope with my name on it. Nathan. Just that. My name in Gerald's handwriting, which I recognized from the Christmas cards. I sat down on an overturned milk crate in the middle of the workshop and opened it. It was 4 pages, handwritten on lined paper. I'm going to try to give you the shape of it without copying it word for word, because those pages belong to me and I'm not ready to share all of them. He started by saying he was sorry he hadn't been more present. He said he'd watched our family from a distance for most of his adult life and had told himself it was respectful, not intruding, giving people space, but that he knew if he was being honest it was also easier. Being at the edges means you don't have to get involved. You don't have to have hard conversations, you just watch. He wrote about my father leaving. He said he'd known, even at the time, that my father wasn't going to come back, and that he'd almost called my mother several times but had stopped himself because he didn't know what to say. He said he regretted that. He wrote about my mother working those 2 jobs. He said he'd sent money when he could, not enough, and that he'd watched her manage anyway, and that her stubbornness had reminded him of his own mother, my great-grandmother, who'd raised 5 children on almost nothing in a small house in New Brunswick and had never once asked anyone for help. And then he wrote about me. He said he'd followed my business from the beginning. He said he'd driven past a job site of mine once, years ago, near Hamilton, and had seen me working alongside my crew and had sat in his truck for a few minutes just watching. Not in a strange way, he said, but just because he wanted to see what I'd built. He said the crew worked well. He said that meant something about the person running it. He wrote, "I don't know what's going to happen with Diane. By the time you read this, you'll know more than I do, but I want you to know that I watched what you did, and I watched what she did, and I want you to understand, without any bitterness, just as a clear statement of fact, that the outcome was not a fair reflection of who you are." I had to put the pages down at that point. I sat in the workshop for a while. The afternoon light was coming through the small window above the filing cabinet, hitting the pegboard where Gerald's tools hung in their clean rows. A level, a set of chisels, a hand plane that had clearly been used and maintained for decades, its blade still sharp, its sole worn smooth. I picked up the pages and kept reading. The last section was practical. Gerald explained why he'd structured the conditions the way he had. The Collingwood property because he wanted me to have somewhere that was mine, genuinely, unambiguously mine, and he wanted me to learn it properly before I owned it, not just receive it without understanding what I was receiving. The Barrie land dispute because he'd been letting it sit for too long, and he believed I could handle it, and he wanted the property line settled before it became my problem. And the 60 days of no contact because, he wrote, you have a habit of walking back into burning buildings to make sure everyone else got out. Sometimes the building is supposed to burn. He ended the letter this way. I'll give you this part exactly, because it's his and I think he'd want it said clearly. I am not a sentimental man, and I don't have any grand speeches for you. What I have is what I've accumulated over 60 years of being careful and quiet and paying attention. I want it to go somewhere it will be used properly. I watched you for a long time, Nathan. I think you'll know what to do with it. The neighbor removed the fence on day 81. Joelle called me that morning. She'd heard from the county, and I was standing on the Collingwood porch with a coffee in my hand when she told me. He decided it wasn't worth the fight, she said. People usually do, I said. You sound like you've done this before. I haven't, I said, but I had a good teacher. She laughed, a little puzzled, and we wrapped up the call. I stood on the porch for a while after. The field in front of the house had gone from the brown of early spring to something almost green, tentative, just the first suggestion of it, the way things look up here in late April when the ground is still cold but the light is starting to mean something. A pair of Canada geese had taken up residence in the low area near the tree line, and every morning they crossed the field in the same diagonal line, going from the trees to the pond on the east side of the property and back again. I'd started keeping an eye out for them without meaning to. My daughter, Abby, was coming up that weekend. She was 11. Diane had been civil, eventually, once her lawyer stopped sending weekly correspondence and I stopped responding to anything that wasn't routed through my own lawyer. The 60 days had passed without me breaking them, and something in that restraint had, I think, shifted the temperature of the whole situation. When Diane had called to arrange the visit, her voice was different. Not warm, exactly, but different. Abby arrived on a Saturday morning with a backpack and a sleeping bag and a very detailed opinion about what we should have for breakfast. Pancakes, she said, getting out of the car. She looked at the house, then at the field, then at the geese. Are those geese? They live here, I said. Do they have names? Not yet. She looked at me with the particular expression 11-year-olds have when an adult has said something inadequate. We should fix that. We made pancakes. We named the geese. Her choices, I just approved them, Sergeant and Marguerite, and we spent the afternoon fixing the section of fence along the west side of the property that the deer had knocked flat, Abby handing me posts while I set them and tamped them, the two of us working in the kind of easy quiet that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. At one point she said, without looking up from the post she was steadying, Dad, is this house yours now? Almost, I said. What does almost mean? It means I have a few more weeks and then it's officially mine. She considered this. It's nice, she said. Yeah, I said. It is. The 90 days ended on a Tuesday in May. Philip Strand drove up from Toronto in his dark blue Volvo and we sat at Gerald's kitchen table. My kitchen table, I was starting to let myself say that. And he walked me through the transfer documents while the afternoon light moved across the room. It took about an hour. There were signatures, witness signatures, notarized confirmations. At the end, Philip stacked the documents neatly, put them back in his portfolio, and reached across the table to shake my hand. Congratulations, Mr. Bourke, he said. Everything is yours. After he left, I sat at the table for a while. Outside the window, I could see the field, and Sergeant and Marguerite making their diagonal crossing from the tree line toward the pond, the same path they took every day, steady and unhurried. I thought about Gerald in his wood smoke house, sending $20 bills at Christmas, watching from the edges, paying attention in his quiet way to things most people didn't think were worth noticing. I thought about my mother in Mississauga, working 2 jobs so that I could have the kind of childhood where I didn't fully understand what was being sacrificed for it. I was going to call her tonight. I'd been calling her every Sunday since I moved up here, but tonight I wanted to call just to say, he was watching, he saw what you did, and he wanted it to count for something. I thought about the letter in the workshop, 4 pages of handwriting from a man I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, who had watched carefully enough and long enough to see things that I couldn't see about myself. I thought about the fence on the Barrie property, and Joelle's voice on the phone, and the neighbor who had finally decided the fight wasn't worth it. I thought about Abby saying it's nice and going back to steadying the fence post. There's a particular feeling, I don't know if there's a good word for it, when you realize that the hardest period of your life was also, somehow, the period when the most important things were being built. Not despite the difficulty, because of it. The conditions weren't obstacles to the inheritance. They were the inheritance. Gerald had known that. He'd structured the whole thing so that I couldn't receive what he was giving me without first becoming someone who knew how to hold it. I got up from the table and walked out onto the porch. The evening was clear and cold the way May evenings still are up here, and the field had that tentative early green color that I was learning to love. Somewhere behind the tree line, Sergeant honked once. Just once. Then it went quiet. I stood there for a long time and I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything.